nothing to lose. Nobody invited Marc Marquez back into this championship. Aprilia handed him the keys themselves, one mistake at a time, and didn't even realize they were doing it until the door was already open and he was standing in the living room. That's the part of this story Jorge Martin has to live with every single day now. The man he's supposedly still leading in the standings isn't chasing him because of anything Martin did wrong. He's chasing him because Martin's own garage lit itself on fire, and Marc simply walked through the smoke. Understand the shape of this properly before we go further, because it changes everything about how the rest of this season should be read. This was never supposed to be a two-way fight. At the start of summer, Aprilia had 4 bikes on the grid chasing one shared dream. Martin and Bezzecchi in factory colors, Ogura and Fernandez wearing trackhouse leathers. 4 separate championship campaigns all pointed at the same crown. On paper, that's not a threat to anyone. That's a firing squad. In practice, it's turned into something closer to friendly fire. 4 riders from the same manufacturer accidentally clearing a path for the one man none of them actually wanted anywhere near this fight. Let's sit in Martin's seat for a second, because that view is uglier than the points table makes it look. He's still got 208 points, still technically the man everyone else in that paddock is aiming at. But Martin himself, when asked to describe the task in front of him, didn't reach for confidence. He reached for honesty, and the honesty was brutal. Beating Marc Marquez means beating, in his own words, the best rider in history. Read that again. That's not a rival talking trash before a fight. That's the reigning championship leader admitting out loud that the man 18 points behind him isn't just fast, he's the standard the entire sport gets measured against. You don't say that about someone you think you've got handled. You say that about someone you've already started bracing for. And notice the language Martin reaches for when he tries to sell you hope. He doesn't say he's closing the gap. He says he'll try to improve every day, try to give his best at home. And if he's able to fight to the end, it would be incredible. Incredible. Not expected. Not planned. A championship leader talking about defending his own lead like it's a lottery ticket he's hoping hits, not a campaign he's actually built to control. And Martin knows exactly how far the gap actually is, because he's the one living inside it. He said it himself. At the moment, Marc's on a level above what Aprilia's giving him, and he's far away from the version of himself that could actually go toe-to-toe. 2 podiums since Le Mans. That's the return on investment for a championship leader over more than a month of racing. 2 podiums. While the man behind him was winning sprints, breaking lap records, and closing an 84-point gap like it was a weekend chore. Here's the part that should keep Martin up at night, worse than any stopwatch ever could. Marc Marquez didn't get invited into this title fight. He forced the door open using Aprilia's own mistakes as the crowbar. Marco Bezzecchi crashing in qualifying and ending up on an operating table instead of a start grid. That's not Marc's doing. That's Aprilia bleeding from a self-inflicted wound. Ogura needing a lucky sprint issue just to salvage a podium at Sachsenring. That's not dominance. That's a manufacturer getting bailed out by circumstance instead of pace. 4 Aprilias on the grid, 1 shared championship dream between them. And instead of building a wall around the title, they've spent the last month tripping over each other, while a Ducati rider who was buried alive in June walked straight through the gap they left open. Now, here's where this stops being a recap and starts being a forecast, because the next 11 races are going to expose something about Marc most of this grid still doesn't understand. Being in a championship fight is not new territory for this man. It's not some fragile position he's desperately clinging to. It's the exact terrain he's mastered more times than anyone else on the current grid combined. He knows when to sit second and let a rival make the mistake for him. He knows when to put a bike where it has no business being just to apply pressure that lives in a rival's head long after the race is over. He knows when to hold a gap steady, like he did at Sachsenring, and he knows when the moment calls for something uglier. That instinct doesn't get taught. It gets earned through years of exactly this kind of chase, and Marc's already lived this movie from both sides. Think about what that actually means for the 5 men standing between him and the crown. None of them have lived at both ends of a title fight the way Marc has. None of them have spent a season leading by 100 points and then spent another chasing from 100 points down, learning the exact pressure points of both positions from the inside. Martin's tasting the leader's chair for the first time under this kind of heat. Ogura's still finding out what it feels like to be hunted instead of doing the hunting. Marc's done both repeatedly, and he's the only rider on this grid who treats a deficit like a puzzle instead of a crisis. But here's the detail that should actually terrify Jorge Martin, Ogura, and everyone else standing between Marc and that #1 plate. What happens if this comeback stalls? If Marc Marquez ever falls out of realistic title contention this season, that is not the version of him to relax around. That's the version of him with absolutely nothing left to protect. A championship fight forces discipline. You calculate risk, you settle for solid points on a bad day. You play the long game because the long game is still winning. Take the trophy off the table, and all that calculation disappears with it. What's left is a rider with no incentive to hold anything back, hunting race wins purely because he can, turning every single Sunday into a demonstration instead of a negotiation. Right now, discipline is working in his favor. The day it stops being necessary is the day this entire grid finds out what Marc looks like with the leash all the way off. That's the cruel irony sitting underneath this entire championship fight. Every rider chasing points wants Marc contained, wants him kept close enough to beat, but far enough that he's still playing by the same rules as everyone else. Nobody in that paddock actually wants to see what happens if he's pushed outside the fight entirely, because a wounded animal with nothing left to lose doesn't race for positions anymore. It races for blood. The safest version of Marc Marquez, for every single one of his rivals, is exactly the version currently sitting 18 points back and still playing the long game. Push him further out, and the whole grid finds out what he looks like when the calculation stops mattering. That's exactly why the mantra for these next 11 races isn't complicated. Pole, lead, finish. Maximum points every single round. No exceptions. No math left on the table for rivals to exploit. That's not a slogan. That's a system. And it's the same system that just turned a 102-point graveyard into an 18-point knife fight in 3 weekends. And the scariest part for the rest of the paddock is that Marc isn't treating this summer break like the rest of them are. While Martin, Ogura, and the rest of the grid actually switch off for a few weeks, Marc's break is shorter, sharper, and entirely functional. No real rest, just a return to training, aligning a body that's still fighting an arm that doesn't fully answer every call, getting it ready for Silverstone before anyone else has finished unpacking their holiday bags. Most riders use the summer to recover from the season. Marc's using it to remove the last excuse he has left. Sit with that contrast for a moment. Somewhere right now, a rival is on a beach, phone off, letting his body finally exhale after a brutal first half. Marc's in a gym, working a stubborn shoulder back into obedience, treating rest itself as a variable he can't afford to waste. That's the difference between a man defending points and a man building a weapon. By the time this paddock reconvenes at Silverstone, one side of this fight will have gotten lighter and looser. The other side will have gotten sharper. So picture Silverstone. Picture Martin walking back into that paddock defending 14 points over Ogura and 18 over a fully rehabbed Marc Marquez, who spent his break exactly the way champions spend theirs. Obsessively, deliberately, without a single wasted day. Picture Aprilia still trying to figure out whether their 4-bike armada is an advantage or a liability. Still one Bezzecchi setback or one Ogura mechanical away from handing Marc another gift he didn't ask for, but will absolutely take. Every single mistake Aprilia makes between now and August is another door Marc doesn't have to force open himself. This is the forecast, stated plainly. No hedging. The rest of this championship isn't going to be decided by who rides the fastest lap. It's going to be decided by who keeps making mistakes and who stops making any. Aprilia's spent the first half of this season proving they can build the fastest bike on the grid and still lose the war to their own chaos. Marc spent the same stretch proving that even buried under 102 points, discipline and hunger can outcalculate an entire manufacturer's civil war. 11 races left. One mantra: pole, lead, finish, and let everyone else keep making the mistakes that keep inviting him back in, one careless weekend at a time. Focus, Marc. Luck favors the brave.